The Quarterly, the Gospel of Mark, Lesson 7, Mark 9, 2-35. Greatness in God's Kingdom. Shortly after Peter's confession of Jesus as the Christ, Jesus took 3 of his disciples, Peter, James, and John, up on a high mountain, where a momentary glimpse of his glory was revealed to them by the Father. Verses 2-7. Yet even this triumphant revelation provided the opportunity to reiterate the point that Jesus' glorification would come through suffering and death, just as his forerunner John the Baptist had also had to suffer. Verses 9-13. Though Peter would gladly have stayed on the mountaintop permanently with Jesus, Moses, and Elijah, they soon had to return to the challenges of everyday life, in the shape of a demon-possessed child, who the other disciples had been unable to heal. Verses 14-18. Jesus, of course, was swiftly able to set that right. But for how long would he remain with the disciples amidst this faithless generation? Verse 10. These events formed the backdrop for the disciples' argument about which of them was the greatest in the kingdom, an argument that was both petty and ridiculous. Greatness in Jesus' kingdom is not like greatness in the kingdoms of this world, where people promote themselves and stab others in the back to advance themselves. Chapter 10, verses 42-43. Rather, greatness in God's eyes is for those who serve with humility, like a little child, and who suffer alongside Christ for the sake of his name. Verses 35-37. Mountains are often places of connection between God and man in the Bible, from the Garden of Eden through to the New Jerusalem. In this case, Jesus went up the mountain with his 3 closest disciples, Peter, James, and John, who together formed a valid quorum of witnesses, according to Deuteronomy 19:15. On the mountaintop, Jesus was transfigured by God, so the disciples both saw and heard his glory. Visually, his clothing became radiant, exhibiting an unearthly purity. Verse 3. He was accompanied by unearthly companions, Moses and Elijah, representing the law and the prophets, the Old Testament revelation that finds its focus and goal in Jesus. According to Luke's account, the topic of their conversation was Jesus' exodus that he was about to accomplish in Jerusalem. Luke 9:31. The deliverance towards which the Old Testament was constantly pointing. Elijah and Moses each saw theophanies of God at Mount Sinai, Exodus 32-34 and 1 Kings 19. And these 2 figures are linked in Malachi 4:4-5 as preparing the way for the Lord's coming. Peter was understandably overwhelmed by the glory of this vision and proposed making 3 tents for these figures. Verse 5. The Greek word is the same one used to translate the tabernacle in the Old Testament. But that would be to put Moses and Elijah on the same level as Jesus, an idea that was already rejected in the previous chapter. In a climactic revelation, God spoke from an overshadowing cloud, saying, "This is my beloved Son. Listen to him." Verse 7. Though Elijah reflected the earlier pattern of Moses in many ways, Jesus was the unique prophet like Moses of Deuteronomy 18:15, to whom Israel must listen. Great though Moses and Elijah were in the purposes of God, they were merely servants in God's house. Jesus is the unique Son. Hebrews 3, verses 5-6. As rapidly as it began, the theophany was over, and the disciples were once again alone with Jesus, verse 8. And he charged them to tell no one of this vision until after the resurrection. Christ's suffering and humiliation had to come first, before it would be safe to tell people more about his divine glory and greatness. The disciples also had questions about Elijah's role as the forerunner of the Messiah. Where did the promised restoration of God's people through Elijah in Malachi 4:6 fit with the coming of Jesus? Jesus answered that Elijah had already come in the ministry of John the Baptist, who so resembled that of his predecessor. Mark 1:6, compare 2 Kings 1:8. Yet John the Baptist's ministry was also patterned after that of the Messiah, whose way he was preparing. John had to suffer in preparation for the ultimate glory that would come through the restoration of God's people, just as the historical Elijah had suffered rejection. See 1 Kings 19. When Jesus and the disciples returned from the mountain, they were greeted by a large crowd, who were said to be greatly amazed by the sight of Jesus. Verse 15. This astonishment suggests, perhaps, that the unearthly whiteness of his clothing may have remained visible at this point after the theophany, as was the case for Moses. But the conversation quickly turned to a more immediate problem: a man whose son was demon-possessed, with the result that he was struck dumb, alongside symptoms that resemble an epileptic fit. Verse 18. This does not mean that the Bible is using spirit possession as a metaphor for this medical condition, merely that the outward symptoms were similar. This man had brought his son, seeking Jesus' help, and finding Jesus absent, he had asked the disciples, but they had proved unable to do anything. Verses 17 and 18. Now this failure is unexpected, since Jesus gave the 12 power to cast out demons in Mark 3:12, and they'd successfully gone out 2 by 2, performing that task in chapter 6, verses 7 to 13. Yet here, 9 of the 12 had together proved impotent in the face of this particularly challenging case. And the fact that the possession had been ongoing since the boy was a child underlined its difficulty. Verse 21. The problem was not merely a lack of faith on the part of the father of the demon-possessed son, but rather a lack of faith in the entire generation, including the disciples. Verse 19. Yet the father's faith was particularly placed under the microscope in the exchange that followed. He first requested Jesus to aid him, saying, "If you can do anything." Verse 22. Now that's an understandable qualifier given the failure of the disciples to cast out the demon, but it's hardly a ringing endorsement of belief in Jesus' power. It contrasts strikingly with the faith of the Gentile Syrophoenician woman in the previous chapter. And when Jesus affirmed that all things are possible for the one who believes, the father responded, "I believe. Help my unbelief." Verse 24. And this affirmation was sufficient for Jesus, who promptly healed the boy with a command, demonstrating his power over even the most stubborn demons, and helping the man's unbelief in the most practical of ways. Though the boy appeared at first to be dead when the unclean spirit departed, Jesus gently took him by the hand and restored him to his feet. Verses 26 to 27. And subsequently, this hard case prompted discussion between the disciples and Jesus as to why they had been unable to cast this demon out. Verse 28. Jesus' response that prayer was necessary, verse 29, may seem odd since Jesus didn't pray when he cast out the demon, but surely that's the point. The disciples needed to pray in faith and ask God to heal. But Jesus, himself the Son of God, had the power within himself to heal, even in such difficult cases. The next stage of Jesus' ministry involved Jesus and the disciples traveling incognito throughout Galilee, while he taught them again of his coming death and resurrection. Verse 30. The announcement of Jesus' forthcoming death and resurrection was much more than an impending feeling of doom on his part. It was a specific prophecy that he would rise again 3 days after his death. Verse 31. No one but God could make such a declaration about his destiny and then fulfill it. However, the disciples still did not understand his teaching about his death and resurrection at this point, let alone believe it. Verse 32. This fact is important for Mark to emphasize, because it debunked the possibility that the disciples stole the body of Jesus or hallucinated that he had risen from the dead. Why would they do that if they themselves didn't expect Jesus to rise? The father of the demon-possessed boy was not the only one lacking faith in Jesus. Indeed, instead of demonstrating faith in Jesus, the disciples demonstrated their own pride and unbelief by arguing among themselves which of them was the greatest. Verse 33. The discussion may have been triggered by Jesus choosing 3 of them to accompany him up the mountain, but it displayed a woeful lack of understanding about Jesus' teaching. The kingdoms of this world allot positions of power and privilege to close supporters of the king. But in Jesus' kingdom, the first place is awarded to those who humble themselves and become servants of all. Verse 35. Not coincidentally, that was the way that Jesus himself consistently behaved as their king. See John 13, 3-17. Greatness in God's kingdom involves behaving like King Jesus, who triumphed through humble service and inglorious suffering before being raised up to the highest place. Philippians 2, verses 5-11. Application questions. 1. What is the significance of Jesus' transfiguration on the mountain? 2. In what situations of your life do you find yourself saying, "Lord, I believe. Help my unbelief"? 3. According to Jesus' criteria, out of all the people you've known, who has been greatest in the kingdom? 4. How did Jesus exhibit his greatness in these ways?